For more on the NATO latest joint military exercise in Brussels, Fraser Cameron, Senior Advisor to the European Policy Center in Brussels. In Beijing, Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department of European Studies with China Institute of International Studies. Professor Cui, good to see you. Tell me more about what is really behind the largest scale military exercise after the Cold War.
I think at least there are three considerations behind this so-called largest exercise by NATO at this moment. One of them undoubtedly is about the situation of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. As we know, recently, because of the political problem, the United States decreased its military assistance to Ukraine. Also, at the same time, most of the European countries, they showed a lot of hesitance to supply long-time, assistance to Ukraine. So I think it's time for the NATO to show its so-called solidarity on its policy towards Ukraine. Secondly, how about this? I think NATO tried to practice its long-term strategy against Russia. As we know, during the last summit, NATO launched a long-term strategy towards Russia, even after this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So I think it's time for NATO to practice it and to show off its commitment, not only to Ukraine and also to all of its member states.
Right.
Of course, I think that there are also third consideration, maybe not so directly, but I think it's important. It's, I think, showed a concern or kind of a worry from Biden administration and also European member states about the forthcoming election in United States. As we know, once Mr. Trump go back to the White House, certainly there will be some negative impact on NATO itself. I think now it's time for NATO to show how it's important, not only for European security and also for American politics.
Well, quite simply, it's concern about Russian activities against Georgia in 2008 and then Crimea in 2014 and then the of Ukraine 2 years ago. This obviously alarmed all NATO members. And there's one thing that Russia respects, and that is power and defense. And so this exercise is a demonstration of NATO's deterrence capability, involving almost 100,000 troops over several months deploying to the Eastern Front. That's a reminder to Russia that this is NATO territory. Please keep out.
Now, let's move on to another question, which is, how do you look at the role of NATO today, given the hotspot and crisis that we have seen in different parts of the world? Russia, Ukraine, it's only one of them, and you also see what's going on in the Middle East. So tell me more, Professor Cui, about how NATO is looking at how the world is evolving and its security role. Is it reflected this time in this military exercise?
I think it's a special and a controversial issue about the role of the NATO, especially after the Cold War. As we know, since the end of the Cold War, a lot of European people, they didn't think that NATO has so many reasons to survive. But as we know, because of the strategy from the United States towards Europe and also the relations between European countries and Russia, I think they give some space for NATO. And now, of course, Ukraine crisis or some other crisis surrounding the European region give another reason for NATO's survival. But now I think the question for NATO could be, how about the NATO to prove that its so-called connective security is still, reasonable for the current European security situation, especially once there are some more or long-time confrontation between NATO and Russia in the future. So how about the space for real European security? I think another very big question for European itself is, once there is a NATO, once there is a more confrontation between NATO and Russia, where is a space for European strategic autonomy? I think now we can find out some maybe new situation. And for example, now the European countries, they try to organize their own military force to, guide its vessels and its transportation through Middle East, through Red Sea. It's a different, I think it's different from consideration from United States and the UK. So I think it shows also the gap between the European security and the role of NATO in European security.
Well, after the end of the Cold War, there were many people who thought there was no need for NATO anymore. And they thought this was the end of history and everyone would be living happily, peacefully together. But of course, it's turned out very different. And now, not only has NATO kept its raison d'etre, but other members, particularly most recently Finland and Sweden now, have set to join NATO. So in essence, what happened of Ukraine has turned out to be an own goal for Mr. Putin by strengthening the alliance, bringing in new members, and all NATO members are now increasing their defense expenditure. So NATO has now got a renewed sense of purpose.
Now, we know the European Union is a combination of many countries. NATO, of course, as a defense alliance, combines members much beyond Europe. So how do you see the different interests, even on the issue of security, and how the interest on security vis-a-vis the interest for economic and trade growth? How do you articulate all of this? How do you see NATO is doing its job at this moment?
Also, it's always a big problem for NATO how to, find out its own solidarity or consistent, goals for all of the member states. Also, now, among all of the member states of NATO, they do have a different concern, not only from so-called strategical level and from a real security level. And we can find out the difference between Washington and Berlin and Paris on the various security concerns. I think now, of course, the NATO tried to expand its missions, not only from traditional security and from some non-conventional security, but now also I think it's given another problem or challenges for NATO, how to find out the common security threat, especially now even on the Russia, we can find the different concern from member states. But of course, I think now it's time, also it's a reason why NATO try to have some more military access and NATO try to have some more so-called threat and also challenges like China. So I think it's, I think an effective development for the NATO in the future, because once they try to have some more solidarity, it try to have to find some more threats. I think it's a very, very bad situation, not only for NATO itself, and also for the so-called European security concern.
There is a growing consensus amongst all European members of NATO that they have to do more. I mean, the pressure has been coming from Washington, notably from Trump when he was president, and there's concern that if he comes back into the White House, this will have implications for NATO as well. So there's now a serious discussion about not only increasing defense expenditure, but also how to make sure that the money spent on defense in Europe is more effective, because it's quite clear that Europe will have to do more in terms of its own defense in the future.
Thank you for your insights.